I want to start, before I get started on the actual presentation, there was a request that went out to us when we were preparing our talks for today to say something that brought us where we are. And one of the things that I hear repeatedly in the debate about global warming and about energy in general is it seems to focus a lot on the environment. And I just want to be clear, I know I speak at least for myself and a lot of my colleagues, that ultimately this is about people. The impacts that global warming are bringing upon us will have incredible negative consequences for a large portion of the world's people, most of whom are not in North America, not just the impacts, but the people themselves. And the way I got to this work myself was my very first class in my freshman year in college about 20 years ago was an energy and economics class in Colorado. We went and visited the Navajo Reservation, and there's the largest and dirtiest coal-fired power plant in the United States is on the Navajo Reservation, the Navajo Generating Station. We visited the mine and we visited this huge coal-fired power plant, and then we went about 5 miles down the road to some villages that didn't have electricity. This was in 1989. I read that as recently as 2003, the Gates Foundation was trying to fund generating projects for renewable energy in those same villages. So I followed those power lines through most of my career to see where they went, and this is where they led me. And so I just want to share that little personal anecdote that ultimately what we do about global warming will largely determine the fate of a lot of people on Earth, most of the people on Earth, and it is about bringing justice and equality to a lot of those people. So I'm sure most of you have seen the Al Gore film and probably read articles and et cetera that seem to be doom and gloom, and the science is true. I hope I don't have to get into that too much. I will talk a little bit about the background behind the science. You've probably also heard about some of the solutions. Wind turbines, solar panels, wave power is something that our mayor here in San Francisco likes to talk about. Capturing and sequestering carbon is a theory that hopefully has a lot of promise. It's something we're going to have to do. But what I'm going to go through today is an analysis from a team of the world's leading scientists and energy economists. That really, we asked the fundamental question, what would it take to actually win the battle against global warming? We know there's a lot of tactical things you can do, like renewable energy, like stopping coal plants, but it's a global problem. What would it take to address this global problem, and actually, what constitutes a win? And so that's what I'm going to get into, and I'm going to sort of share abbreviated notes from a bigger study that's also a piece of a comprehensive and more coordinated philanthropic campaign. And so it's sort of a preview of things to come, but hopefully it'll whet your appetite. So the first thing that we need to know if we're going to try to win the battle against global warming is we have to define what a win is. And for the purposes of the study that we did, we essentially try to figure out how much emissions would we need to stop, how much abatement would we need to find in the world to halt global warming at 2 degrees centigrade. There's a reason you want to do 2 degrees centigrade, and I don't want to spend too much time on the impacts because we're going to get to some more interesting things here. But the primary reason is that beyond 2 degrees centigrade, global warming goes nonlinear. And what that means is you'll lose your ability to do anything about it. You start to have feedbacks that are essentially impacts that build upon themselves, and you've lost the game. So the first goal is to define the win, and the win itself is halting warming at 2 degrees centigrade. This short chart gives you a sense of what happens. I'll just walk you through a couple of these. The snows and glaciers in the Himalayas are a big buffer. They act like a big buffer for the people in the Himalayan plain, which at last count I think was close to 1/3 of the human race. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. But the precipitation patterns in that part of Asia are essentially monsoons with drought in between. But people can live with it more or less because of the snow. What the snow enables is it stores the water during the periods of heavy precipitation, and then it slowly melts off during what essentially amounts to a drought, and people can use that water. Beyond 2 degrees centigrade, that snow is gone. So now you have these intense monsoons, the floods get bigger, and the droughts get worse. So you've made what's already a tricky part of the world to live in, virtually impossible to live in for a large chunk of people. The same goes for ecosystems. Beyond 2 degrees centigrade, you start to see mass extinctions. We've heard a lot about polar bears and coral reefs. The word on coral reefs is not good. Hopefully we don't lose them all. But beyond 2 degrees, you start to see the mass extinctions that have really historically occurred when there have been high concentrations of carbon in the atmosphere. So you do see a lot of significant environmental impacts, and especially what happens to human populations. The thing that concerns me the most, and the thing that concerns a lot of scientists the most, is this first one that I sort of mentioned, which is climate system feedbacks. That's when you start to have compounding effects that you can't stop. Just as an example, there are huge quantities of methane that are trapped in the Arctic tundra. Methane is 20 times as powerful as a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. When you have rising temperatures, that methane is released in the atmosphere. It has about a 1,000-year cycle in the atmosphere. Game over. So we have to act now. Just to give you a sense of where we're headed. The blue line is where we're headed right now. So that's business as usual. What the scientists also figured out is what would it take to head off global warming at 2 degrees centigrade. Essentially, we need to get down to that lower yellow line to stabilize concentrations of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalents, which includes all the other gases, by the year 2100. If we can reduce global carbon dioxide emissions by 30 gigatons by 2030, we have a chance of capping warming at 2 degrees centigrade. This is based on the latest research from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the UN body that sort of accumulates all of the science. But that's a huge reduction. We're right now at somewhere around 40 gigatons of emissions a year. We're headed to 80 gigatons of emissions per year. In 2030, at this pace, we'll be at 60. We need to be at 30. That's half. We have to cut our global emissions in half. Where in the world would you go to do that? So we know this is what needs to happen. The question is how? So as a part of our study, we asked these scientists to look around the world and find all of the emissions. And this is what they came up with. This had actually never been done before. And there's some of the details in here that you probably can't see from your chair, but I'll explain it to you in broad brushstrokes. Essentially what they identified is there are 7 sectors where you can find most of the emissions you need to get to a win, and that is halting global warming at 2 degrees centigrade. Those sectors are power, so utilities, industry, buildings, transportation, forestry, agriculture, and waste and other sources. So now you know where the emissions are. This is essentially a roadmap to win the battle against global warming. It's a design to win, if you will. It's the first time it's been done. It's pretty consistent in terms of its treatment of emissions. And the best part is that we can get 83% of the reductions you see here with known technologies that are commercially available today. This is something we can do today. Why aren't we doing it? I'm going to get to that in just a minute. There's an important first thing you have to do as well. You have to set priorities. So now we know the 7 sectors we need to act in to win the battle. But you don't just go at them all at once. We probably don't have the capacity. We certainly don't have the political capital. We might not even have the financial capital to actually do this all at once. So the first priority is to avoid lock-in. What I mean by lock-in is there are decisions we're making right now that will dramatically determine our ability to address this problem in the future. For example, coal-fired power plants, by far the worst offenders. If you build a coal-fired power plant today, you will lock in the emissions from that plant for up to 50 years. That's the lifespan of a coal-fired power plant. There are a number of these proposed in the US. I'll show you an example of where some of them are right now. But you cannot build those coal-fired power plants, and you especially can't build them unless you're absolutely ensuring carbon capture and sequestration, which is the ability to take the carbon dioxide from the coal plant and pump it underground and sequester it and make sure that it's not going to enter the atmosphere. Another major source of of emissions is buildings. A lot of buildings, I think most buildings in the US actually leak like sieves. Those are sources of additional carbon emissions because they're using energy that they don't need to be using, that are essentially providing safety and comfort to the people in the building. You know, the thing that Amory Lovins, a famous energy researcher and economist, used to talk about was people don't want, you know, the refrigerator to be 40 degrees. They want a cold beer. And it's the same is true in our buildings. We don't want our buildings cooled to a certain temperature. We want them to be comfortable. So we know how to do that, but we have to do it all over the world. Buildings last 100 years or more, and we have to stop building buildings today that are releasing huge amounts of emissions into the atmosphere. Just as an example, China is in the process of building an entire USA right now. Over the next 17 to 20 years, they're going to build a USA worth of houses, factories, streets, cities, shops. It matters a whole lot whether they build green buildings, compact layouts, efficient transportation systems that stitch it all together. If their cities look more like Houston than like Paris, we're in serious trouble. And so we have to help China understand how to build sustainably. So the first thing we have to do is make investment decisions that avoid the lock-in, avoid new coal-fired power plants, build infrastructure that is climate safe, carbon neutral, or carbon negative. So this is a first-term priority. These are things that we have to do. They have to be done in the next 10 years. So just to recap real briefly, the first step here is don't lose. So we've defined the win, and we've determined what's first in getting to the win, and that's avoiding the lock-in. Part two is position to win, so you want to accelerate the deployment of clean technologies, ensure that innovation is shared across economies and across national borders. And then by 2100, you've won. You've stabilized at a level that's higher than what a lot of scientists think is okay, but it's lower than utter disaster. And so that's what this sort of shows a roadmap toward. Just again to show the challenge of why we need to do this very quickly. The top line is our current path going towards 60 gigatons of annual emissions per year. The bottom line is 30 stabilized at 2030. And those different shadings, those are the wedges. Some of you might be familiar with a study that was done a couple years ago by a team of scientists at Princeton, Robert Sokolow and Stephen Pacala, I think were the two, who identified these wedges. What we've done is we've dissected the wedges and found the locations on Earth where you can find those emissions. And then you have a small chunk of emissions reduction that are not known at this time. We're sort of anticipating that somebody might come up with a solution. There actually are solutions that would fit into that category that are already in development. But here's what happens if you wait. Now you've built buildings that are inefficient. Now you've built coal-fired power plants. Now you have this huge chunk of unknown mitigation, and you don't know where to find it. And the reason you don't know where to find it is it's not there anymore. You've lost your chance. This has to happen in the next 10 years. We have to get started today. So in addition to the 7 sectors, you also need to know how to prioritize your resources to know where to look. So we know that power is a problem. We know that transportation is a problem in buildings. But you don't want to just go into every country and address those sectors in every country. You have to set priorities. And fortunately, one of the things that this group did was they identified the regions of the world where you get most of your emissions. So now you can set priorities. As it turns out, there are 6 regions that really matter when you're talking about getting these emissions reductions. China, everybody's heard about that. India, one of the fastest growing economies and the largest democracy on Earth. The European Union has shown a lot of leadership, but they have major challenges. The political support for emissions reductions in Europe are not nearly as deep as they need to be. They need a lot of help over there. And then, of course, the United States, where energy efficiency may be a sign of personal virtue, but it's not a strategy for national energy policy, as our Vice President once so eloquently said. So this is your roadmap to a win. And then the final thing that I do want to mention on here, this is incredibly important. We absolutely have to preserve the world's remaining tropical forests. The majority of those are Indonesia, Brazil, and Congo. There's a new mechanism that's being developed right now that is, it's called REDD. I won't get into what it is, but it's essentially a funding mechanism that helps national governments protect their their forests and preserve them over a long period of time. So how do you do that? Well, what we believe from experience is that policy is the key. Just as an example, the global energy market is a $4 trillion market, $4 trillion per year. We're not going to displace that with just extra taxes paying for extra green technologies on top of what's dirty now. You have to redirect existing investment to clean technologies. And the only way that's going to happen is with policy. The only way you get somebody to invest in a solar plant instead of a coal-fired power plant is because a policy says the coal-fired power plant is more expensive because we want it to be. Just as an example, I was at a conference a couple years ago at Goldman Sachs, and I met with a guy who was doing their solar portfolio, and he sat down the hall, because it was in their energy group, from a guy who's doing their coal portfolio. And they were friends, and they used to talk about this stuff, and the guy doing the coal said, I don't have a choice. I have to invest in coal because I have a responsibility to maximize my return. We need to pass policy so that that's no longer the case, so that those investors now say, I can't invest in coal because solar is the better option, and that's going to take policy to make it happen. We also need to do the same thing on buildings. You don't want to continue to allow people to build leaky sieves for buildings. We have to make them efficient. We need green building standards, and we need to replicate them globally. So policy creates standards for markets. Policy drives massive investments. Policy is the key to winning more than any other realm. One other thing that I wanted to show you is this sort of is the underlying cost curve behind our research. This shows you what it would take to abate 27 gigatons of carbon by the year 2030. So this is most of the amount you need for a win. As you can see, I'm going to see if I can make this thing work here. Over here, this is abatement for a profit. This is below the cost curve. So these are all things you can do and save money doing and prevent carbon from going into the atmosphere. The problem is we have incentives in this country and in many countries to waste energy. The classic example that I use here is there's a tax credit on the books for SUVs in the United States. It's something like a $50,000 write-off or whatever it is. And so people go and buy these cars because they're essentially lower cost than a more efficient car. We got to end that. We have a similar problem with our utility policy, where most utilities in this country are incentivized to build new power plants rather than invest in efficiency. We've addressed that in California by incentivizing investments in energy efficiency, investments in green technologies. We've made it work here. We need to make it work everywhere. Just a few quick examples of what I'm talking about, because I know I'm running out of time. But the power sector priorities, so the first key intervention, no new conventional coal plants. We have to stop coal. It is essentially immoral for the Western developed world to be building new coal-fired power plants in this day and age. It's wrong. We have to stop it. We have to develop carbon capture and sequestration technology. There are going to be coal plants built. They're being built in India and China. We have got to help them capture and sequester the carbon from those plants if we're going to win. We need renewable portfolio standards, and we need them everywhere. These are incredibly effective policy tools that dramatically accelerate the deployment of renewable energy. And we need to take a hard look at nuclear power. I personally am incredibly skeptical. I don't think it's viable. I think it's mostly, there's significant financial hurdles, but they are carbon neutral sources of energy, not carbon neutral, low carbon sources of energy, and we need to leave them on the table if in the event that we need them down the road. So stopping conventional coal plants, there has been a concerted effort in the US guided by a coalition of philanthropic efforts and a large group of NGOs to stop coal-fired power plants throughout the United States. They've been very effective. We need to replicate that kind of activity in Europe and in other places where they're being built. We've stopped 28 so far. I was personally involved in a couple of these in Idaho and Nevada. You can stop them. We need renewable portfolio standards, not just in the states, but nationally. One of the things that's happened as a result of this coordinated effort is that we've put a lot of pressure on Congress to enact a national renewable portfolio standard. So now we've got 28 states, including most of the largest states in the country with these standards. It's putting a lot of pressure on Congress to act. There's actually a 15% RPS pending in the energy bill, which would save 300 million tons of carbon dioxide by the year 2030. That's not trivial. That's 10% of the goal right there. Sorry, 1% of the goal right there. Same thing for cars. The Prius should be the standard, not the alternative. We need to expand our investment in rapid transit and replicate that around the globe. The EU and Japan are already way ahead of us on fuel economy. China took action this month that made their cars far more efficient than any cars built in the US. We need to do it here as well, and we need to ramp these standards up with time. And then finally, with forestry, we have got to protect and preserve the world's remaining tropical forests. There is no substitute for intact tropical forests, for the carbon sink, for the water purification, for all the other ecosystem services that they provide. This is a mandatory intervention we have to take care of. It's all got to be done in the next 10 years. And the best part is we do have time. Most of this we can do with things we already know how to do, but policy is incentivizing the wrong behavior. So with that, I guess I'm gonna wrap up just really quickly. This is a teaser of what's to come. We have found how to win the battle against global warming. It's going to take a concerted effort. It is taking a lot of global coordination. There's definitely room for optimism, but there is not a lot of time. And the efforts have to be many times larger than what they are now. So, thanks.